world's most popular blog, Boing Boing.
It's the most popular blog called Boing Boing.
It is the most popular blog called Boing Boing in the world. He's also somebody who is an activist and a writer concerned with intellectual property issues and new ways of dealing with copyright and making money off content, which I think is of particular interest to all of us who live in China, because basically there obviously needs to be a new way if anybody's going to make any money off content. He's a science fiction writer who makes his books available for free downloads on the internet, but still makes money publishing them by traditional means. So I think he's got a lot to tell people in China who are concerned about media and IPR issues. So without further ado, I'll hand over to him. Thank you for coming to Beijing. Cory.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you all for coming. So the basic format, I think, is I'm going to read you a short story that Forbes commissioned for me. They're doing an issue on the future of work, and they asked me to write them a story about work in America in 20 years. And I ended up writing a story that was a lot about what the relationship between America and China will be over the next 20 years. Very speculative. As William Gibson says, science fiction writers are about predicting the present. So this is my act of radical speculative presentism. If there's anyone in the audience who's not a native English speaker, which I suppose is the case, please don't hesitate to wave at me and tell me to slow down. I will not take offense. I'm a fast talker by nature, and having been in situations where there was simultaneous translation at the UN and so on, I know for a fact that I talk too fast for people who aren't native English speakers. I'm the bane of the UN's translator corps. So I will read the story, and then I'm going to talk a little about the issues that underpin the story, and then we'll have some Q&A. Thanks for coming.
Oh, Cory,
yeah.
Can you get it turned down? Oh, they just did.
They just did. All right. From your mind to their speakers. Other people's money. Gretel's stall in the dead Walmart off the I-5 in Pico Rivera was not the busiest spot in the place, but that was how she liked it. Time to think was critical to her brand of functional sculpture, and reflection was the scarcest commodity of all in 2027. Which is why she was hoping that the venture capitalist would just leave her alone. He wasn't a paying customer, he wasn't a fellow artist, he wanted to buy her, and he was 30 years too late. You know, I pitched to you guys in 1999 on Sand Hill Road. One of the founding partners, Kleiner, I think, guy ate a salad through my whole slide deck. When I was done, he wiped his mouth, looked over my shoulder, and told me he didn't think I'd scale. That was it. He didn't even pick up my business card. When I looked back as I was going out the door, I saw him sweep it into the trash with the wrapper from his sandwich. The VC, young with that waxy, sweaty look of someone who eats a lot of GM yogurt to try to patch your biochemistry, shook his head. That wasn't us. We're a franchise based here in LA. I just hang on, this is not going to work. I'm going to have to read this open on my lap. We're a franchise based here in LA. I just opened up the Inglewood branch, but I can see how that would have soured you on us. Did you ever get your VC funding? Gretel tossed her tablet with a crash on top of an overflowing barrel of Primo plastics and wiped her hands on her cunningly stitched dress, quilted from the back pockets of vintage bootleg Levi's, their frayed misspelled tags on proud display. Son, that was 1999. Within a year, VCs weren't writing term sheets, they were doing cram downs on anything halfway decent in their portfolios, forcing out the founders, trying to flip them before the market cratered. But it wasn't that pitch that soured me on Sand Hill Road. We were in Inglewood. Yeah, you said. What the hell, it was Wednesday and she had all her week's commissions done already. The VC was at least pretty, if you like them young. He had good teeth. They all had good teeth now. And a cute bump in the bridge of his nose that spoke of a little bit of brawling before his B-school days. Okay, here's the thing. I had running code, 500,000 users. Those were big numbers then. We did moderation matching, a heuristic that figured out whether a message on a message board was flame bait, flagging up the worst offenders to volunteers who blindly checked each other's. The BBC was hand moderating 1 million message board posts a day back then. We could do better, but no one thought we'd scale up. Our customers were little guys, hot rodder boards, cooking boards. Most of them were doing everything for free in exchange for, we're getting everything for free in exchange for serving as our reference customers, which was how all those biz dev weasels did things back then. By 2007, we were Web 2.0. I mean, we'd been Web 2.0 since Web 0.9, But now it seemed like the world was ready for us. All we needed was some capital to pay for our features that our freeloading reference customers wanted. I met with every single shitweasel, junior analyst, on Sand Hill Road and brain dumped for him. They wrote great reports. We got nothing. No one was doing investments then either. It was all acquisition driven. Stupid Sarbanes-Oxley killed IPOs and the VC went with it. The stall across the way was half the size of hers. The old Shenzhen couple that ran it were really gnarly, covered in old burn scars from working in the plastic tag factory where they'd met. Now they sold nostalgic hardware, old working specialty appliances and devices from the WTO's heyday. They were highly complementary to Gretel's own business, which is why they had such a friendly relationship. The old woman, she called herself Chloe, was giving her a little hand gesture that meant, "Do you need help getting rid of this jerk?" "It's okay," Gretel said to her, waving. "Want to do lunch in 20 minutes?" The old lady rocked back and forth. "Not nutritionist food," she said. Gretel nodded enthusiastically. Nutritionist food wasn't even food, just nutrients and flavoring. It was 80% of the stalls in the food court now, since the capital cost of a food printer and feedstock were practically nil, and any food hacker could differentiate himself by thinking of exotic new texture, flavor, temperature combos. 20 minutes, Mr. VC. Uday, he said. Uday Gonzalez. He passed her a card, laser-etched on a jumbo lima bean. She pocketed it. You'd have thought that I'd learned my lesson by then, but no, sir. I'm the original glutton for punishment. After Bubble 2.0, I took my best coders, our CFO, and a dozen of our users and did a little healthcare startup, brokering carbon-neutral medical travel plans to Fortune 500s. Today that sounds like old hat, but back then it was sexy. No one seriously believed that we could get out from under the HMOs, but between Virgin's cheap bulk ticket sales and stellar medical deals in Venezuela, Argentina, and Cuba, it was the only cost-effective way. And once the industrial workers of the World Wide Web signed up 80% of the U.S. workforce through the World of StarCraft guilds, no employer could afford to skimp on health insurance. The word would go out during that night's raids, and by morning you'd have picket lines in front of every branch office in the country. We had all the right connections, but by then I was a 40-year-old woman, and that's as close as you can come to invisible in this society without having brown skin or a janitor's uniform. I didn't even get a chance to get ignored in their offices. We couldn't even get meetings. Not once they found my social network profiles and saw what I looked like and the codgers in my social network. So that's when I threw in the towel. I bought a Dremel tool, then a hot glue gun, then a CNC lathe, then a mill, and then I got serious. Well, it seems to have worked out for you. The VC leaned over the display cabinet. She saw his reflection in the clear top. His eyes were wide with genuine admiration. Okay, she thought. Okay, you get another 5 minutes, Uday Gonzalez. She opened the lid and made fortune teller passes over her pieces with her hands. Pick them up, that's what they're for. He went for the fish first. Its scales were individual slices from the skins of old Nokia phones. Back when it was just Nokia, not Marvel Comics Mobile. And each articulated on its own little sprig of memory wire. The gills were scuffed iPod backings, the logos just recognizable under the fog of scratches. The eyes bore HP and PlayStation logos, respectively, and the lips were made from inner tube strips that bore the smallest, visible, recognizable logo marks. As he lifted it, it settled into his hand, arching back to find his thumb and palm nestling in there. It'll work like an old-time phone, she said. It'll even do a little lookup from old-style exchange numbers to different identity registers and try to get you a voice call with someone. Do people really do that? Some do. Most just want it for the objectness of it. It's got a lot of emotion. The scuffs, that's what did it. They were like stories, those scratches, each one a memento mori for some long-dead instant in some stranger's life. He picked up another piece. This one was purely sculptural, made from several generations of iPhones, their screens carved into abstract shapes and then painted with networked OLEDs that stitched them together into a single display. The abstract shapes and colors combined with the device's aggressive incursions on your personal area network to give you the sense of holding a vampire, something transgressive, savage, dangerous. When was the last time you owned a device that felt that dangerous? Never! The VC seemed to surprise himself with his vehemence. He fumbled the device, caught it, set it down reverently. Gretel laughed. Oh, you can be rougher than that. My little critters love adapting to hard circumstances. She tossed the vampire high in the sky, let it come down on the floor, having righted itself in the air to take the drop on its armored back. You can't break it, it's made of garbage. The VC fondled each of her pieces, making genuine, appreciative noises. She could tell the difference between genuine articles and fakes. I remember all these things from when I was little, he said at last. I wanted them all so badly. Each one seemed impossibly wonderful and out of reach. Yeah, she said, that's what does it all right. That feeling right there. You watch these go from fetish item to 6 for $1 in the blister packs at the pharmacy checkout. This gives them back their dignity. Can I ask how many of these you sell? Enough, she said. As many as I can make. I mostly do commissions, but only with people who come down in person. I won't sell online. Getting off email was the best gift I ever gave myself. You are hard to reach, he said. Nope, I'm easy to reach. You just have to haul ass here to Pico Rivera. There's even parking if you're that kind of pervert. I think I see why you aren't interested in capital, he said. You can't scale this up. Not with all the money in the world. Gretel laughed. You VCs, scale, scale, scale. It's all you think of. You're wrong, as it turns out. This business decomposes into 4 elements: materials acquisition, design, fabrication, and retail. And they all scale like crazy. Take materials. After the WTO, the Chinese spent 25 years brute forcing the problem space of all possible 3D plastic objects that an American might pay money for. There is no shortage of that stuff. Most of it is sitting in international waters somewhere on a container ship, waiting for someone to pay the carbon taxes to land it somewhere. I can bring in all the junk electronics and chassis and parts that I want, and I print the actuators, controllers, wires, and the rest of it here. Design? Design's easy. Roll the parts through the tumbler and let each one get scanned good. Then run the evolutionary algorithm to see how they can fit together. I just watch it, tweaking it, culling the ugly mutants, cultivating the pretty ones. I can do 50 original designs in a day, and by the time I'm done with any random container, I'll have used up more than 80% of its payload. The rest goes to some feedstockers to be eaten by bacteria. Manufacturing? Just monkey labor. Easy. Every kid takes shop class nowadays, especially the girls. I made cars for my parents' anniversary, he said. Fuel cell cars? He snorted. No one wants to drive a truck anymore. Sub-micro solar. Fast little things. He picked up the fish again. And retail, that's just you here. So if you could scale up, why don't you? Why should I? I'm making incredible money now. I could stand to double my operation. But for that, I'd need what, 60 grand? What's the smallest angel round you do at your franchise? Well, we're very nimble. How nimble? He mumbled something. Speak up. 300K, he said, blushing. But that doesn't have to be all to you. We could roll your round up with 5 or 6 similar firms and increase my communications and bureaucracy overhead by 3,000%. Yeah, that sounds swell. I net enough after expenses that I could double every quarter if I wanted to, but I'm growing organically, cherry-picking my best contractors and getting them on the payroll, expanding poco a poco. I'm 60 years old, Mr. Gonzalez, and I don't need to grow like a tumor anymore. He put the fish back down. It flopped. You say you're nimble, but from where I sit, you're nowhere near nimble enough. You're starting off in the 300 grand range, and you're probably averaging $1 million in your angel rounds, 10 or 20 for Series A, 70 for Series B. I can turn 60 grand into 600 grand in 6 months. That's pretty good for me as an individual, but I can't turn your million into 10 million, not in 6 years. How much does your franchise have under management? We're a gigafund, he said. He managed to make it sound like a boast. She shook her head. You poor, poor boy. How are you going to spend $1 billion in $300,000 increments? You'll be sitting on 3/4 of that by the time you cash out the fund. It's the smallest amount that a franchisee can take, he said. Well, sure. The parent company's got what, $500 billion under management? Don't look so surprised. I keep up with the shenanigans you Mighty Morphin power brokers get up to in Silly Valley. No wonder they're franchising. But the secret is, big money is dumb money. I can spend $100 so smart I can turn it into $1,500. You look like a smart kid. You could probably make 1,000 out of 100, but you'll never do the same trick with your billion in other people's money. Whoever sold you that franchise conned you, sonny. He looked glum. Oh, cheer up, she said. You're a young man. Getting shafted by VCs builds character. Look at me. He picked up the fish again. She knew what he was going to ask without having to wait. She named the price. But for you, a 10% discount. He shook his head and put it back. I can't afford that, he said. What are you doing tonight? He cocked an eyebrow at her. Don't worry, I'm not interested in your youthful limbs. I just have a spot on my 3rd shift. One of my girls is pregnant and she's taking some maternity leave. You pull 6 hours starting at 11 p.m. and you can take that home. I'm not supposed to moonlight. He caressed the fish's scales. They rippled under his finger. It's due diligence, she said. He smiled. He was very pretty, and he built 2 cars. That wasn't bad. He'd do okay. Maybe he'd even work out and end up one of her regulars. Think about it, she said. I close down at 6 p.m. You come by then if you're interested, and I'll give you the details for the Fabrica. She locked her cabinets and set out her gone to lunch sign, then hopped over the display case, vaulting it the way she'd learned to do in yoga acrobatics class in Silver Lake. Lunchtime, Mrs. Wang called to one of her daughters to come out and staff the booth, then came around on her cane. No nutritionist food, she said. Certainly not, Gretel said, sprinkling a wave at the VC as he moved off among the stalls in the dead Walmart. That's the story. So before I move on to the speechifying part of this, while I have a sip of water, are there a question or two about the story? Entirely self-explanatory. That's how I like them. All right. So if this speech has a title, it might be Futurism Sucks. I gave a talk on this subject a little while ago at a Foo Camp, one of the O'Reilly conferences in Silicon Valley, and they seem to like the title. Futurists back in the 70s, and maybe even a little earlier if they were particularly prescient, started talking about the information economy and the coming information revolution. And they had a nice catchy title, which I think is a prerequisite if you're going to do effective futurism. You need a good catchy title, and they had that in information economy. But they were shy on details. No one really knew what what information economy meant. But a lot of people assume that it must mean buying and selling information, which of course means restricting the flow of information, because you can't have an effective market unless you have property, and you can't have property unless you can exclude people. You can't buy and sell soybean futures if anyone can walk into the future soybean crop and walk away with them, regardless of whether or not they've paid for the soybean futures. So in order to have a market, you have to have the ability to exclude people, and that, in the case of information, means the ability to limit people and in their copying of information, knowledge goods. And this implies, of course, that the information economy and the information society will be a society in which there are fewer copying machines, which is to say computers, and fewer copying systems, which is to say networks, and that they will work less well, and that they'll be slower, and that they'll be harder to get access to, and fewer people will know how to use them, and that they'll be less efficient. And this turned out to be wrong. I think today we can see that an information society is one in which we have more computers, more networks, where computers and networks get faster, where more people know how to use them, and it's challenging what we know about the information society and about the information economy. And this is bad news because, of course, many of the world's economies are retooling to be based on information. So to give you some examples about the futility of controlling copying and controlling the spread of information in the 21st century as we get more IT, I thought I'd pick a couple of my favorite whipping boys. The first one is something that we call digital rights management, or depending on who you're talking to, digital restriction management. It sometimes trades under the name copy protection. I used to be a systems administrator, and this offends me because I never protected information by not copying it. The way systems administrators protect information is by making lots of copies of it. Jaron Lanier, the inventor of virtual reality, once proposed that you could really protect information by encoding it in cockroach DNA, because there'd be trillions of copies and they'd survive even a nuclear war. I think the best term for this is probably copy prevention or use control software. And the pitch for it has rarely been, we will stop people from making copies, because unless you're pitching to really ignorant people who haven't been paying attention, this pitch doesn't have a lot of credibility, because we know that these systems fall like dominoes. That an industry will spend 5 years and $10 billion inventing an anti-copying system, and a teenager in Norway will break it for breakfast. Recently, a guy who calls himself Mueslick64, so he named himself after cereal. He first broke HD DVD, and that was pretty impressive. It hadn't been out for very long, but he owned an HD DVD system, so he had lots of access to it, so he was able to break it. But then he went on to break Blu-ray without ever actually seeing or holding a Blu-ray player. He broke it purely like just by looking at information that he could get about Blu-ray over the internet. He didn't actually need to ever touch one, like Sherlock Holmes' smarter brother Mycroft, who could solve mysteries without ever leaving the apartment. He had this over Sherlock. So the pitch has not been, we'll stop people from making copies. the pitch has been, we'll stop everyone except Norwegian teenagers and hackers who name themselves after breakfast cereal from making copies. And since most people aren't teenagers, and most people aren't, and most people who we care about aren't poor, because the other people who will go to the great lengths to make copies are poor people for whom trading time for money makes a lot of sense. You can trade a lot of time invested in figuring out how to break the copy protection or copy prevention because you don't get a lot of money, and it's cheaper for you to spend your time doing this than to spend your money buying legitimate copy. But most of the people that we care about aren't poor, they aren't students, they aren't hackers. They're like average people sitting in their living rooms, 18 to 34, who spend a lot of money on media. And those people don't know how to do this, and they never will learn how to do it, and so we're safe. But of course, every time one of those theoretical, mythical, average consumers, and this is really terrible, but the examples are always people's mothers or grandmothers. So my grandmother, she types 120 words a minute and has a computer, and she sends me email. My mother has a PhD, so they're bad examples. My grandfather, on the other hand, was he was a watchmaker, and he never mastered anything digital. So my grandfather will never learn how to use these technologies. But every day we connect more people like my grandfather to the internet. Every day we teach more people like my grandfather about general purpose search tools like Google. And today, you don't need to be a super hacker with a name derived from breakfast cereal to get a copy of a movie that doesn't have any DRM on it. What you need to do is know how to go to Google and type in Harry Potter, download, torrent, right? And up it comes, right? So it turns out that the more IT you have, that is to say the faster that networks are, the more ubiquitous they are, the more people we hook up to PCs and so on. And of course, the governments of the world are spending fortunes to hook their citizens up to the internet. And every company in the world is in a race to deliver a cheaper PC. You have one laptop per child that's going to sell a $150, $100 laptop starting in a few months, and so on. Every time we do this DRM pitch becomes less effective. But what actually happens is that every time you deliver DRM restricted media to someone who was naive or law-abiding or whatever adjective you want to apply to them enough to go out and spend money instead of stealing it, that person rapidly runs up against the limits of the anti-copying software. So for example, if you bought a Google Video from Google Video, they last month turned off the Google Video server, so now your Google Videos don't play anymore. And they initially wrote everyone an email saying, tomorrow your videos stop working, but here's a credit. You can buy things with Google checkout money if you want to go to a store that sells Google checkout things, not videos, because you can't buy those videos anymore, but other stuff. If you decided that you were tired of owning TV shows and you wanted to use your money to buy groceries, here's the money you spend on the TV show to get groceries. So imagine you came home one day and the man who used to own Tower Records, it's bankrupt now, had come into your house and taken away all your DVDs, but he'd left you with a credit to buy groceries with the money he'd spent on the DVDs. You might feel understandably a little disgruntled about this. So at that point, those people say to themselves, I wonder if there's a better way to get DVDs. I did download that movie. I wonder if I just went to Google, where of course I paid for these movies, but I went to the other part of Google and I typed in download Star Trek movie, what would come up? And those people discover that if you buy movies, you get ripped off, but if you steal movies, you get to own them forever. And so those people stop being customers. So DRM uninvents the customer. Now there's another kind of information restriction, and that's something, of course, all of you know about if you are expatriates or locals here living in China, which is the Great Firewall of China, which I spent a lot of time worrying about before I came out. How, the internet is my outboard brain. How would I function without it? I was going to run up against its limits, and I'd be pitting my puny Linux systems administration tools against the greatest engineering minds that the party can muster. They are nigh omnipotent. If you upset them, they can have you jailed and then executed and cut up for organs and given to party members. I mean, this is. If they can motivate engineers with that force, what hope did I have of ever looking at Flickr again? As you know, once you get the food coloring in the swimming pool, it's very hard to get out again. And even the greatest engineering minds that the party can bring to bear have been largely ineffective at it. You could, in fact, get rid of the bad search results on the internet. All you need to do is take away everyone's computer. But most governments are unwilling to do this because even if they think that they're headed for an information economy, they understand that if you take away everyone's computer, it's going to be bad for your short-term competitiveness. So, and they're not the only ones. I mean, the party are hardly alone in making this mistake and continuing to bash their heads against it. I mean, Paris Hilton found out the hard way that once the video is out there, you can't bring the video back. The King of Thailand learned this. Even the Science Fiction Writers of America, who you'd think would be a very forward-looking gang of people. You know, I'm a member, a former director of the Science Fiction Writers of America. It was founded by one of my mentors, a great writer named Damon Knight, and I pay my dues every year. They just sent a takedown notice to a site called Scribd. Scribd is a site that's like Flickr for text. You can upload any text file you want, and they host bazillions of text files. And if you want to get a text file taken offline because it infringes your copyright, you go through a process called a DMCA takedown notice. And you can use these no matter where you are, but it's an American law. Actually, this law, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, came about as the result of a treaty, and that treaty is called the WIPO Copyright Treaty, and it's in effect all over the world. So most countries have a similar set of rules for taking down infringing materials. And so all you need to do to get your material taken down from Scribd is you send them a letter saying, I swear on penalty of perjury that this file at this URL is my copyrighted work, and I want you to remove it. So notably, what you don't have to do is you don't have to go to a judge, and you don't have to present any evidence, and you don't have to hire a lawyer. All you need to do is send them a takedown notice. And if it turns out that your takedown notice is sent in error, generally speaking, the penalties have been very low. That's changed a little recently. Diebold got fined $125,000 for sending takedown notices, averring that a leaked memo from Diebold showing how they'd systematically used their voting machines as part of a fraudulent felony voter fraud in America. They said that this was a copyright infringement. They didn't say it wasn't true, but they said the memo infringed on their copyright, and they were fined $125,000 for that. Other people have been fined or have had to withdraw their complaints recently, and there are some lawsuits pending. But by and large, the penalties have been very low. Now contrast that with, all these books here. If it turned out that this book infringed on my copyright, if James Patterson had quoted more of my book than constituted fair use, and I wanted to get this book removed from this bookstore, I couldn't show up and say, I'm Cory Doctorow, I'd like to show you a passage out of this book that infringes on my copyright, and I'd like you to take this book off your shelf right now. I couldn't go to the publisher's office and do it. I would have to go to a court, and I would have to get an injunction, and I would have to have that court serve that injunction here, and it would be expensive and tiresome and difficult. Now, Scribd were pretty good actors about this, although not good enough for the Science Fiction Writers of America and other people. If you sent them a letter and you said it didn't have to comply with the whole DMCA takedown notice regime, but it would have to be formatted more or less like one. You'd have to send them a letter saying, this file is mine, take it down. And that wasn't good enough for the Science Fiction Writers of America, who think would be very forward-looking, but aren't very forward-looking by and large, or at least the people who are running it, the president and vice president, aren't. Now, to be fair, they ran unopposed in the last election. It's one of those organizations that's run entirely by volunteers, and we often get the kind of government we deserve. But they thought it wasn't good enough for them. They thought that Scribd was being a bad actor because they had failed to take affirmative steps to prevent infringing material from showing up, which, as far as I could tell, meant that Scribd should figure out what all the copyrighted in the works in the world were, and then search for them all the time on their database and make sure that none of them were there. Or at least all the copyrighted works that had been created by Science Fiction Writers of America members, tens of thousands of them. This is impractical. It's impractical. Compiling that database is impractical. Policing that database is very impractical because, of course, if you changed a few sentences on the web page, it would disappear. And after the storm happened, there were a lot of claims that they could have been better. They could have done things like put up a text field where the people who submitted the files could put in at the author of the file. And so if you were ripping off Cory Doctorow, you could write Cory Doctorow in the field, and then I could go and find all the Cory Doctorow files and have them taken down. But of course, if that's all it takes, if all it takes to engage in piracy without getting caught is to not fill in that field accurately, then they wouldn't fill in that field accurately. As my friend John McDade said, you can imagine that the theoretical discussion among the pirates, right? Our mateys, we'd best be turning back, there be text fields ahead. This is an ineffective means of preventing piracy. So the Science Fiction Writers of America, they had a long ongoing correspondence with Scripty, and Scripty said, we need you to tell us which files you want taken down. We'll take them down, you just tell us which ones. So they did a search, and they said, we're going to search for all, we've had permission from Robert Silverberg, who's a friend of mine, a great writer, and the Isaac Asimov estate to police their copyrights for them. We're going to list every file that you have on your website that contain the words Isaac Asimov or Robert Silverberg. And we'll send you those. So not Isaac Asimov, Asimov and Silverberg. So I have a Creative Commons licensed novel, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, that was hosted there. Some fan of mine had put it there. He's allowed to do it. Not a copyright infringement. That file includes a very kind blurb, a review from the former editor of Asimov Science Fiction magazine, a guy named Gardner Dozois. It has the word Asimov in it. So that file was listed as one of the files they couldn't take down. As were literally dozens, if not hundreds, of other files. Now, SFWA has got caught sending this bad takedown notice. Included in the takedown notice were things like a junior high teacher's list of 300 great science fiction novels that you can show to kids to get them excited about science fiction. And he wrote to me and he said, I didn't know that it was against the rules to tell people about science fiction novels by name. I guess I should stop. He wasn't being sarcastic. He just doesn't know anything about copyright. No one knows anything about copyright. It's an industrial regulation practiced by white shoe lawyers working for giant, IP firms around the world. And, it makes sense for a lawyer at Universal to call a lawyer at Warner's and say, well, we're planning an unauthorized Harry Potter joke book. Let's talk about whether or not it's fair use. What doesn't make any sense is for like a 12-year-old in Brighton to call up a lawyer at Warner's and say, well, I've put some Harry Potter fan fiction on my website. Is it fair use or isn't it? Those people can't negotiate these rules. It's like having to go to the Security Exchange Commission every time you want to buy a friend lunch and file a Sarbanes-Oxley report about this disbursement. It doesn't make any sense, and it never will make any sense. And anyone who says, well, all we need to do to solve this problem is educate people about copyright is crazy. If we have to educate people about copyright in order to save our industry is doomed, because we're not going to educate people about copyright. To be educated about copyright, you need at least a law degree and probably a little more, by and large. Pam Samuelson, arguably the world's greatest copyright scholar, for whom the Samuelson Clinic at UC Berkeley and George Washington University is named, just published a paper called Preliminary Thoughts on Copyright Reform, in which she points out that the American copyright statute, 17 U.S.C., has been revised 11 times since it was adopted in 1976, is more than 200 pages long, and arguably no one in the world, including lawyers, judges, and law students, or law school teachers, understand it. Right? No one understands the American copyright statute. Literally, no one. 11 patches later, that code is so crufty that no one will ever unpick it. It's time to scrap it and start anew. So the point, though, of this story is that the Science Fiction Writers of America, in their post-mortem statement by the president of the Science Fiction Writers of America, said, we still believe that we need to stand up for the rights of the author, and the fundamental thing that an author needs to be able to do is control copying of his works. And today, it is much easier to commit piracy than it is to take works down. Well, it's pretty easy to take works down. I don't know how much easier it can get, right? If all you need to do to take works down is call up the ISP and say, it's mine, take it down. The next step, as far as I can tell, is the giant database of everything that might be copyrighted, policed 1 million times a day against every database that hosts material to see if it's infringing and remove it immediately. And I don't think that's coming. So another example of taking the food coloring out of the pool, that those of you who are from diaspora populations, which by definition, if you're either Chinese or you're an expat living in China, you're part of some kind of diaspora, is region coding. And territorial rights have been a staple of the entertainment industry for a long time. It's been one of the ways that they've maximized revenue, and it's exploited natural forms of arbitrage. It was really hard to export things that were sold in one region to another region. For one thing, it required clearing customs, and if you were going to do it in anything more than a kind of hand-to-hand way, eventually a container ship would land somewhere, and someone would go in and go, wait a second, what are these 50,000 Filipino copies of Gone with the Wind doing in America marked not for export? So it was tricky. But today, we inhabit a world where diaspora populations are in instantaneous communication with each other and not only don't understand but are unwilling to participate in region coding. And even as this is happening, and of course China and Hong Kong and the Philippines and any place that's a crossroads, we're ground zero for the first region-free players. And a lot of people don't really understand this, but the reason that region-free players exist is that the people who license DVDs, the DVD Forum, when they started their licensing program, didn't leave enough money in the pool to sue people who violated the licensing terms. So you could pop up in Malaysia or Shenzhen or anywhere and do a little startup, sell region-free DVDs, and as soon as they came knocking for the $250,000 a day that they were allowed to fine you according to your contract, you could just disappear again. They never fined you. They just didn't have any enforcement money. Now with DVD CCA, the people who are doing ACS licensing for high-definition DVDs, they've left a lot of money, and apparently they're going to sue people for this. And we'll see how long that lasts, right? Are you really willing as a diaspora population to put up with not being able to watch the movies you brought from home, right? Not the movies you stole, the movies you brought from home that you paid for. I think most of us probably aren't going to be willing to do it. And yet, region coding is more and more built into anti-copying systems, which encourages more and more defection and civil disobedience. One example is DVB CPCM, which is the anti-copying stuff in the TV standards for digital TV in parts of Asia, Europe, parts of Latin America, and Australia. This includes something called the authorized domain. And the idea is that if you broadcast a TV show, you can flag it so that only one household is allowed to watch it. Well, what's a household? You know, it seems reasonable at first, but what's a household? Well, a household is whatever, 10 representatives, European representatives and American representatives of IT, film, and CE companies thought up in a meeting in Brussels 6 months ago that none of you were allowed to attend. And those guys, they put a lot of energy into figuring out how you could have a household that encompassed a summer home and a main home and a minivan that had a seatback DVD that the kids were happy with. But I said, well, how about here's a different household. What about the household where mom and dad live in Manila? They have one daughter who lives in Los Angeles and works as a domestic or an au pair, and they have a son who's a construction worker in Saudi Arabia. And they say, well, that's a corner case, right? It's an edge case. We don't need to plan for that. That's not our middle case, right? It's like, well, this isn't minority. This is world majority, right? The world majorities of households look nothing like summer home, minivan, main house. That's not the world's majority of households. So what they're doing is they're breeding a generation of civil disobedience people who see no reason to respect copyright, people who understand it to be ridiculous, and those people are going to be very hard to bring back into the fold, just like my granddad when he discovers that he can't watch the movies that he bought, and so he better go and steal them next time. So this is not to say that copyright is dead. Policeable uses of copyrighted works, that is to say, uses where you can police the copyright without spending more money than you would get if you catch someone who's infringing the copyright, are up. So there are new licensing markets for advertisements, international markets for reuse in advertisements, sync rights for films, and so on. There are people who are discovering this all over the world. You put some stuff up on Flickr, and a publisher you've never heard of contacts you and offers you some money to reprint it in their book. Those people you can police, right? They produce physical artifacts. They have a street address. They aren't some nebulous collective of people like the open source movement. Nor are they ideologically committed copyright abolitionists like the Pirate Party in Sweden. They are a firm who are incorporated, who have an address that you can actually visit, and those people, if the cost of licensing your copyright is low enough, would rather license it than risk the lawsuit, because of course they're making new copyrighted works too, and it's a little bit of a protection racket. If they can convince everyone to pay them for their copyrighted works, then they get money too. So it's a great deal all around. And there are more policeable uses than ever. But copyright is not the heart and soul of the information economy. What industries benefit from widespread access to IT? Well, you have things like shipping and logistics. One container leaves China every second for America. And there are, of course, more containers leaving for everywhere else in the world from China. That would be literally impossible without IT, without global communications networks, without access to PCs, and so on. For one thing, you'd never get people like Bunny Huang, who's second generation, American-born Chinese, parents are Taiwanese refugees. He's the guy who broke the Xbox, but he's also, that was just a hobby for him. He's a MIT PhD engineer who's just in a little startup called Chumbi. They're manufacturing in Shenzhen. How did he find people in Shenzhen who can manufacture his stuff? Over the internet, right? Everyone in Shenzhen is a participant in the information economy because there would be no Shenzhen manufacturing sector if like a guy with a little startup and $50,000 couldn't source manufacturing in Shenzhen that way. So manufacturing, of course. Publishing. My publisher, Tor Books, does more first novels than they've ever done in the history of publishing. They're not a little boutique publisher who you'd think of as being interested in first novels. They're the largest science fiction publisher in the world. What enables them to do this? Well, it's the fact that their setup costs, their production costs, and their distribution costs are lower than they've ever been. It used to be that the cheapest way to bring a book to market was something like this, a mass market paperback. And the break even for something like this was 50,000 copies. So you couldn't buy a first novel unless you were willing to print 50,000 copies of it. That's a really expensive proposition. There aren't a lot of writers that fit that mold. And certainly you wouldn't take a lot of risks with 50,000 copies. Now, with a hardcover today and new production techniques enabled by IT, you can break even on 4,000 or 5,000 copies. And there are a lot of writers who have that many relatives. Right? So they can take a flyer and they can print dozens of first novels every year. Well, this is great news for publishing. It's great news for new writers. It's certainly downloads of books may or may not end up disrupting publishing, but to say publishing is losing from the internet, losing from the information economy is wrong. Publishing is participating in the information economy not by buying and selling information, but by exploiting IT to make the cost of printing books lower. And there are lots of examples of this. Dave Eggers, you probably know McSweeney's, a hipster publisher, prints in Iceland. Right? Why does he print in Iceland? Because he can print in Iceland. It turns out that's the cheapest, most efficient way for him to do it. You can bet that if he had to do that business by telegram and long distance line, that he wouldn't be printing in Iceland. Right? The fact that he can send PDFs to Iceland is what makes it possible. I recorded a radio column for the CBC last week in Tokyo, or Yokohama. I didn't actually go into a studio to record it. I had a Plantronics microphone plugged into my Linux laptop, and then I was on the phone with the guy. So I had the phone wedged under my headset with a recording engineer, and I would record a bit, and then I'd email it to him. He was in the studio over there, and he'd go, take that mic and just move it. It's a little hot. Could you move it just up and to the left a little? And then I re-record, and he'd go, that's it, that's sweet. And I was doing multiple takes and sending it to him. He edited it there. 15 minutes later, it was back on my laptop in Yokohama, and we had done this between Toronto and Yokohama, and our cost of doing it, the net communications cost of doing it was zero. We did this for free. So this is a traditional information business, copyright business, a radio station. They weren't buying and selling information to benefit from the information economy. They were using networks to do things that they could never have done before for lower cost than they could ever have imagined. The IT industry, the music industry, all those MySpace bands that sell 500,000 CDs by giving away stuff on MySpace, or the techno brega artists in Brazil who in fact allow people to sell their CDs without paying them any money. Anyone can sell any techno brega CD, and they charge $50 to get into their shows, and they pack 10,000 people into the house every weekend. Right? Artists have always gotten like a 7% royalty from their CDs anyways, and that royalty didn't even start to tick over until you paid back the cost of production, the cost of promotion, and then they still took money out for breakage, and their funny accounting practices meant that you probably didn't see much of what was left over unless you were Keith Richards or Paul McCartney, and making so much money from your shows that the money from your CDs was like one more ivory-handled back scratcher for your giant mansion. So they realized that the money from CDs was never the main source of income for most recording artists, and they just went to town. Yes, there's a breed of recording artist that sits in his studio and releases and never goes on tour, and that guy is probably not happy with this, but there's a whole nother generation of recording artists who love this because it fills their live performances. So those guys are benefiting from it. The IT industry, of course, benefits from it. And one of the great exports of the developing world is engineers. And all businesses that benefit from cheaper communications, cheaper customer acquisition, cheaper coordination, and cheaper travel. When I landed in Los Angeles last year when we moved there, I punched in my zip code and barber shop into Google, and I found a nice barber who never used a computer, who was nevertheless a participant in the information economy because his cost of acquiring me as a customer was zero. Management firms, tour operators, tiny hotels, and restaurants. We needed a pregnancy massage in Shanghai last week, and everywhere we went, they said, "Oh, we don't do pregnant ladies." We found the pregnancy massage by Googling. They don't use computers. They didn't have a computerized register. They wrote down everything in paper, but they found customers who never could have found them. They didn't speak English. We didn't speak Chinese. The way that we found this business was by using the internet. They are participants in the information economy. They are beneficiaries of it. Every sector of the economy, except for those based on controlling the spread of information, benefit from the information economy. Now this is backwards, right? We spent the last 20 years writing treaties and policy based on the idea that an information economy would benefit primarily businesses that controlled information. And today, we primarily benefit businesses that don't control information with information technology. And that means that those two policies, that policy and that reality are completely out of sync. And moreover, the more policy you write to help people control the spread of information, the worse it is for all the businesses that benefit from the unfettered control of information. When you add copy prevention to a CD, to a PC, you raise the cost of the PC. When you add copy policing businesses or duties to an ISP, you raise the cost of using the network. You don't stop copying. You don't benefit those people who are hoping to control copying, but you raise the cost of doing business for everyone else. So it ends up harming everyone else. So we are making these national bets. If you open up a copy of, I think it was the China Daily that we got in our hotel a couple of weeks ago in Dalian, we opened it up and there was a page sponsored by the Chinese Information Ministry. And it said, and it was all the things China was doing to make it harder to make copies in China, right? Particularly copies of foreign works in China. And they were talking about all the new patents being filed in China and so on. Well, America, when it formed as a nation, spent 100 years pirating the copyrights of every country in the world. There was no copyright for foreigners in America for 100 years. That's how they became a developed nation, right? It makes sense to have copyright if you export copyright, because then people are sending you money. But if you import copyright, it's crazy to give foreigners copyright if you're a developing nation, because all you end up doing is shoveling money off of your shores to some other country for stuff that you can get for free. The fathers of the American Revolution understood this. They weren't going to send America's gold to England, who they just spent 3 years kicking out of the country, fighting tooth and nail, spilling blood across their fields. They were going to send their money home to England. They were going to take Charles Dickens' copyrights and pirate the shit out of them and use the money to fund Mark Twain. Because he was a made-in-Britain guy, or a made-in-America guy. And it wasn't until Mark Twain was selling so much in England that he was infuriated by the pirate editions in England that they started to look into bilateral treaties with England, and that's when it made sense for them. So China and the rest of the world are opting into an information economy vision that makes no sense. And the country that doesn't make that bet, the country that's smart enough to bet against where all the dumb money is going into protecting information, is the country that benefits the most. And we'll see how this goes, and we'll see if China can muster the political will. I have a feeling that China is going to have problems because it not only wants to protect information from being copied because it wants to make America happy, but also because it makes the party happy to control the spread of information. And it may be that China makes the wrong bet and spends 5 or 10 years learning the hard way that you can't take the food coloring out of the swimming pool, but we'll see. So thank you. So Q&A?
Thank you, Cory. Yeah, Q&A, questions?
Hi, Cory. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So in China and in Korea, there's a very advanced model for virtual items. Particularly
Virtual items.
Virtual
Yeah.
items. But virtual items in these games can't be freely copied.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain value, and if it was freely copied, it would devalue the item.
Yeah.
So it requires some sort of protection system to keep it from being copied. So do you think that's a different sort of...
So I think that there's there's a deeper question, which is what happens when you have giant important economies, which these things are turning into, that are not run by constitutional democracies or even by states, but rather by Fortune 100s. And what does it mean to give a Fortune 100 its own pocket economy? We've seen what happens with exotic derivatives markets in the last couple of weeks, when you get people trading derivatives of derivatives of derivatives. And really, when you have people trading futures in how many points up the database the pointer is going to move if you spend 2,000 hours killing orcs, that's a pretty exotic derivative right there. But it does have a really different information security model. There's two important models here. One is conditional access, and the other one is preventing copying after delivery. So conditional access is like going to an ATM and you can't get money out of the ATM until you authenticate to it. You put your card in, put your PIN in, and out comes the money. They don't try to control what you do with the money after you get it, but they do try to control how you get, whether or not you can get the money. Online games, massively multiplayer online games, are able to control what you do on their server, right? Because they have basically a conditional access system. And because online games act nothing like a real nation, particularly a real democratic nation where you can take your wealth with you when you leave, that pointer in that database has no life off the database. So you can amass virtual wealth, but you can't exchange that virtual wealth except on pirate markets, right, which are illegal and subject you to all kinds of crazy bad stuff, or sometimes by controlled exchanges run by the company themselves, which is essentially the same thing. And what you end up with there is the virtual equivalent of Soviet Russia or apartheid South Africa, where you could have 10 billion rubles, but try spending them anywhere outside of Russia, China, or Cuba, and you'd be very disappointed. And you couldn't take them with you outside of the country because the government wouldn't let you take your wealth with you. You hear stories about South Africans who converted their wealth to diamonds at 10 cents on the dollar and then sewed it into their pants legs and then fled the country during apartheid because your wealth couldn't leave the country with you. As soon as wealth can leave games, the whole thing is different, because at that point you then have heterogeneous databases and you have them trying to authenticate to one another, and I think that it'll be gameable in a way that it's not today. My next novel, not my next published novel, the next novel I'm going to write is about sweatshops and MMOs and virtual economies. It's called For the Win, and it's about virtual unions, the industrial workers of the World Wide Web, and virtual Pinkertons and virtual wealth.
I have a question about online versus print media. I mean, I get a lot of information from the internet, but I also like to sit and read the paper. I'm just wondering, are the print newspapers going to be history in a few years?
Well, I don't know about China's newspapers, which obviously have a different economic model from others. Although in some ways it's very market-driven, but there are at least some that have state support. But other newspapers particularly in the U.S., are crumbling for reasons that have nothing to do with their reportage or their social role, but entirely to do with their classified advertising. Newspapers are primarily a vehicle for delivering people to advertisers by taking a kind of big bucket that is newsprint and throwing everything into the bucket that might entice people to look at the newspaper so they can see an advertisement. So there's no coherence between classified advertising, Ziggy cartoons, horoscopes, articles about official corruption, and movie listings. Those don't actually, they have nothing in common with each other except they're things that might be in a newspaper, and the reason they're there is because they entice people to read newspapers. And classified advertisers don't care about the social role of newspapers. You don't put an ad in a newspaper because you think news is good. You put an ad in a newspaper because it's the most cost-effective way of reaching people. And the internet's more cost-effective. And so newspapers are losing their advertising revenue left, right, and center. And they're being stuck with trying to run their newsroom and trying to accomplish all the social stuff that a newsroom accomplishes with much less money. And it's very hard to do. And I don't know that anyone has a great answer. One thing that is that some of the newspapers are noticing is that you can monetize your archives, and that might keep the print edition in print as well. The Boston Globe and other papers that have opened up their archives are getting shitloads of traffic to them because bloggers can see them, and so bloggers can make inbound links to them, and as soon as you make an inbound link to something, you increase the probability that someone will find it. Once you increase the probability that someone will find something, you increase the probability you'll get another inbound link, and so on. Whereas the New York Times has taken its old archive and locked it up. And that has turned out to be just really dumb. I mean, yesterday's news is by definition the least valuable piece of the newspaper. But they had this old line revenue stream, which is that companies would pay an intermediary a lot of money for access to the New York Times archives. And that intermediary paid the New York Times. And they didn't want to piss that intermediary off. And so they decided they would lock up their archives. And it was the wrong bet. I mean, in the long term, that intermediary is about as useful. It used to be that if you read these old accounts of Depression-era America, there was a trade called chiropodist, and they were people who come to your house and trim your toenails for you. And the intermediary is the chiropodist of tomorrow, right? I mean, people are going to figure out how to do their own intermediary for the New York Times, right? And you know, we are not going to pay professionals to assemble databases of the New York Times for us anymore.
Well, thank you.
You're going to have to help me, huh? Sorry.
Pass that back, please.
Thanks, Cory. Really
Not at all.
enjoyed your talk. I was having a conversation with my sister just the other day, and she's been holding off on Facebook. She's been resisting. And it's gotten to this point where she went back to Montreal, and she was meeting all these old friends that she hadn't seen in about 2 years. And then one of them said to her, "Oh, you know, I'll see you later. I'll see you on Facebook."
Uh-huh.
And she was a little disturbed by this.
Mhm.
She couldn't. For her, she was having this real thing about, oh, what is happening? You know, all of a sudden, these people that I respect and people that I socialize with within the context of what she saw as normal human relationships, face to face, all of a sudden are saying, well, we'll see you on this virtual social network. You know, and I threw this conversation out to friends the other day. I mean, how are social networks changing our existing social reality?
So first I'll say that the best person to read if you want to know about this stuff is Dana Boyd, D-A-N-A-H-B-O-Y-D, who's a genius on this stuff. Yeah, someone's a Dana fan. So Dana's awesome, and she knows more about this stuff in her little pinky nail than I will learn in 100 lifetimes. However, that said, I think that she coined a really interesting term in respect to social networks. She calls them autistic social networks. And the thing about them that's autistic is that they take something that in the real world is implicit and cannot be articulated in very explicit terms, which is the kind of thing that people who are autistic have a hard time grasping, is the implicit relationships between people. And they attempt to enumerate them. So they basically make you say things like, is this person your friend or not? Is this person your contact or not? Is this person your ex-girlfriend or not? Is this person, you know? And so we often have a very, very kind of nebulous relationship with people. I kind of am your friend, I'm kind of not. We know each other, we don't. We fall in, we fall out. I pretend that I'm your friend, but I'm not your friend, but it's easier to pretend I'm your friend than to tell you that I think that your breath smells. And besides, I only have to see you twice a year at a family reunion. I mean, we have this huge kind of an unarticulated, nebulous set of relationships that define what it is to be human. And we derive a lot of social power from not having to articulate our social network. So for example, when someone comes up to you and says, I'm single, do you know any cute girls? Or boys. You get to choose whether or not you're going to tell them about people and whom you're going to tell them about. And so this is a great source of social power, because you can, for example, choose not to tell them about the cute single friend you have because you actually don't like them very much, right? So I don't really like you very much, I'm not going to introduce you to my cute friend. Or you can choose to introduce them to some of your friends but not your other friends because you don't think they get along. Or you don't want this whole group of friends that you have over here who are like Starbucks smashing anti-globalist black bloc anarchists to know that you're hanging out with this guy who works for Arthur Andersen. So you're going to introduce him to this lady over here, right? So this is you derive a great deal of social power from this, and it's very, very useful. But at the same time, as human beings, we are confronted with a grim social reality, which is that we live through a series of life cycles. You know, Procter & Gamble people live and breathe this. You know, you're a small child, you're a bigger child, you're an adolescent, you're a teenager, you're young 20s, you're married, you have kids, you're retired, and so on. And that at each of these, we tend to shed a lot of our social networks like insects shedding chrysalis. Not because we don't like those people, but because maintaining the social context through which we knew them is hard, right? They're not in your dorm room anymore. They're not in your dorm anymore. You don't see them at school anymore. You don't see them at work anymore. You don't live at home anymore, and so on. So these people drift away, and it's easy to get nostalgic about these people. Some of them you probably would be great and good friends with if you could find them again. And there's a real temptation to go and use these networks. I got on Facebook because the people from my summer camp were on Facebook, and I missed them. And so that was the way I could gather with 50 people from my summer camp. And immediately I got on Facebook to get together with these 50 people, and I found myself confronted with 200 people, maybe half of whom I actually knew, who wanted to be my Friendster, and only 5 of whom I wanted to be Friendsters with, and 4 of those people I already was in regular contact with on email. And now we were doing email, except we weren't doing email. What we were doing is they would send me a fake message on Facebook that would then generate an email to my inbox that would say, you have a message, which I'm not going to tell you what it is, somewhere else. Come be my sticky eyeball, generate a page impression for me, read this message, and then send an equally fake email back using a crummy text editor built into a browser. It doesn't have a spell checker and doesn't work nearly as well as Thunderbird or Eudora or whatever, and exchange fake email and get more and more entangled in this with every passing day. And so the systems themselves are really kind of infuriating. I was on the advisory board for a firm called Ludicorp that made a service called Flickr. It's an image sharing source. And one of the things I insisted on really early on is that everything should be, everything that it sent you an email for, you should be able to reply an email. So if I send you a fake Flickr email, you can just hit reply and send me an actual email. And it will go back to you on Flickr, but also land in your inbox. So the whole message goes to you. They don't try to make you into a monetizable eyeball. They just treat you like a human being. And so most of these services don't. But even if they do, to the extent that they explore some useful social relationship, they stale date, because the longer you sit on one of those services, the more Friendsters you end up with who actually aren't friends of yours and who you had to add for some reason that is out of band, like they're your boss and you actually don't like your boss, but you don't want to tell your boss that you don't like your boss. And eventually you hit a critical mass where every time you update your wall on Facebook and go like, holy crap, I got so shit-faced last night at the club, you discover that all these people who you actually don't want to know that